Godfather, Godfather. Pulled up to the scene in a 65 Bentley, dripped in Brioni, China doll with me, looking like a supermodel. Oh, what a feeling. 25 years old, 25 million. Today's the audition for the Godfather part. My life's already a movie, so when do I start? I walk up in Patsy's, East 119th Street. Fat Tony Salerno gets a kiss on the cheek. I know my way around, not my first time here. Been doing overnight Ziganet loans for 10 years. I say hello to Danny Pagano and Tough Tony. Nicky Domino gives me a nod, they all know me. They ask why I'm there so early, I say the part. They say what part? I say the movie, why not? I don't look like Carlo, they all begin laughing. 3 p.m. ready for the lights, cameras, action. Gianni getting his own.
My name is Gianni Russo, a.k.a. Carlo, the infamous son-in-law from The Godfather. I'm now known as the Hollywood Godfather, and this is my story.
Welcome, everybody. It's time for another Hollywood Godfather podcast. Me, being Gianni Russo, the senior of the group, is the first one to introduce the lady of the group, Jeannie Riemann.
Hello, everybody. So great to be back with you.
And my partner in crime and literary and podcast, Mr. Pat Picciarelli.
Hi, everybody. You're probably going to ask me, what are we doing this evening?
Yes, what are we doing this evening?
Funny you should ask. We've got a very interesting guest. You know, I've been on a quest for the last 6 months to try to find something that documents organized crime in a smaller city and small town America. We've been talking, and we have a lot of material in New York, Chicago, LA, Miami, New Orleans. We've covered it all, overseas, Sicily, et cetera, et cetera. But I've been living in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area, for 30 years. And while I thought I knew something about organized crime in this area, I didn't even scratch the surface. I got a hold of a book that I recently read, and I said, I have to get a hold of the author. So our guest tonight is Paul Hodos, who wrote Steel City Mafia. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh,
Our pleasure. Believe me.
Like
he told me a few things about it.
Yeah,
now, I know some people from there, but what you're telling us is a little beyond what I thought. But I knew some control.
I mean, it's also beyond what I thought. So, to organize the conversation a bit, Paul, could you tell us how organized crime, as everybody knows it, this was a typical organized crime, how it wound up and began in southwestern Pennsylvania?
So to begin with, it was like in a lot of other places. It was in the late 1800s. There were a lot of black handers, so individual Italian criminals that were kind of controlling some of the little towns in Western PA. And then eventually, like later 1800s, early 1900s, gangs started to form in Pittsburgh itself. And some of these gangs, joined together eventually around a little before World War I, around World War I. And that's when you could start identifying some leaders, but it was pretty chaotic back then. And then, really my book starts out in the 1920s, when there's a little better idea of who the actual boss is of the area, and the family had coalesced from, those disparate groups and the black handers into something that you could call an actual mob family.
Okay, as a writer myself, I was really impressed with your level of research. I mean, there's something new practically every paragraph. Can we start with the bosses from the beginning, the Manarino brothers, and
sure.
Mike Genovese, who was, by the way, you can explain it, but no relation to Vito Genovese in New York.
Sure. And so, like I said, in the 20s, there were a few bosses, in the 30s too, that were killed, and there was a lot of violence because of prohibition and a lot of infighting. And then that was kind of settled in the later 30s and in the 40s by a guy named Frank Amato Sr., who stabilized the family, brought everyone under control, and started making money, not headlines. And then after him came one of the most famous Dons, which was John LaRocca. And he was Amato's protege and expanded the family's interests. And he basically became the boss in about 1957, right around the time of Appalachian. And his protege was Michael Genovese. And Michael Genovese was basically his number two, number three. It sometimes roles switch up until the 1980s when Michael Genovese became the boss. And then he was.
Are these all immigrants in 1980?
So no. So Mike Genovese was the child of immigrants. He was born in 1919. John LaRocca, his mentor in organized crime, was an immigrant himself from Sicily. So in the IRS said, not the IRS, the border authorities at the time were trying to expel him because he was committing crimes and he had come into the country illegally. They asserted. He eventually beat that case, but after him, the leadership went to someone who was born in the United States, and that was Michael Genovese. And you mentioned the Manarino brothers; they're also very important in not only the earlier history of the family, but up until 1980. They were the Samuel and Kelly Manarino. They were the leaders of the New Kensington faction of the family. So they were never actually the boss. Their highest ranking brother was Kelly Manarino, who was under boss in the 70s.
Who oversaw those families? Do you know? Like New York?
What's that?
Who oversaw those families and gave them permission to organize? Was it New York, Chicago?
Yeah, so Pittsburgh fell under, from what I found, the Genovese family in New York.
Yeah.
And it seemed like they were pretty much on their own in those really early days I was talking about, pre-Prohibition. But after the commission was formed, they fell under what became the Genovese family. And one of the bosses, his name was John Bazzano Sr. in the 30s, actually killed some of his rivals. It was basically Pittsburgh's version of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Three of the Volpe brothers were killed, and they were big wigs in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, big organized crime figures back then. And one of the brothers was big in organized crime up until the 1980s. And when he killed those three brothers, the remaining brothers, and there were many brothers, complained to the commission about him. And it was their first act of sort of like enforcing the rules. They called Bazzano into New York to have a dinner, and he said some things that they didn't like, which made them think that he was not contrite about what he had done. And they ended up ice picking him to death and garroting him. And then his body was found in a burlap sack in Brooklyn.
Okay, what I thought was unusual was that the Pittsburgh mob, before even they started expanding, didn't necessarily stick to the rules. They were taking in people to work with the gang that weren't Italians, even took them into the higher levels, so to speak. They had some juice, and these were non-Italians. They also worked with the pagans. They also allowed dealing in drugs. Mm-hmm. Now, that surprised me. Why wasn't that controlled by New York? I mean, that's a game killer as far as, somebody gets arrested.
They didn't know, that's why.
I was surprised that, Paul, did they know?
So I am not, to be honest with you, I'm not sure if they knew or not. But New York did, the two things that I saw that New York kept control over during the time that I looked at in the book were how many people were in the family, so how many made members they had. There was a limit on how many they could have. And then also when they could make guys. Like, I know that the leadership in the 80s had to consult with the Genovese family when they were about to make people. Now, who they made was kind of
I
up to
know a
them.
little more than most people about the commission. With what you're saying, the commission always dictated when you open your books and when you could take people in. And it was done by earnings, or you did some big favors like murder. So those rules never changed. It wasn't state to state. The commission had to oversee it, unless you wouldn't have got the booze for during Prohibition to begin with, and you would never got organized. They would have wiped you out. They had to have control. So I mean, it's wild that they did that in those suburbs so far away.
Well, it's not that far away. It's a 7-hour drive. It's not really that far. But considered the Midwest, but that's a stretch. The drug dealing was fairly much in the open, I thought. What was the attitude, Paul? I mean, were they trying to hide it? I mean, everybody was involved in drugs. Sanctioned.
So they really weren't trying to hide it. I will say this. So according to, and I interviewed a law enforcement guy who was the handler for one of the leading drug guys who was also a MAID member. And he told me that that his source had told him that Michael Genovese really did not like drugs, but that he basically was looking the other way when people were handing him that money. He knew it was coming from them. He was a smart guy. There's no way he didn't know. But that he was opposed to it. It's sort of in principle, and also with the danger it would pose to his family members and him.
What was that, by the 50s?
It was just too much to resist.
Was that by the 50s and 60s?
No, the drugs really came into their own, I'd say, in the late 70s, and then really in the 1980s. The coke craze was a big deal for them.
Well, see, in the 50s and 60s, it started in New York, and then slowly people knew, like you said, they turned a blind eye to it, and even the Gotti family did that with Peter. I mean, it was just too much money to let go.
Okay, Paul, to expand on what Johnny said about opening the books, yeah, New York controlled when the books could be opened. But as far as Pittsburgh was concerned, and apparently New York agreed, that they didn't have any say in who got made.
That is what I've seen in some of the sources I used, is that they had control over who they were making, and that I don't know that New York would even know who these people were, to be honest with you, because obviously a lot of them were just local guys. But and the one that you referred to that was the real outlier is Chucky Porter, who eventually became the underboss, and he was at least half Irish, half Italian, possibly 75%. That's what he claimed, Italian, and then 25 Irish. But the difference being, and I know that there have been other people who have been made who have had that mixed ancestry, but their name is usually an Italian name. For Porter, it was that Irish name.
And he was made.
And he was made, and he became the second in command.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I'm surprised that New York didn't hear about this. I mean, they were causing quite a stir. I mean, there was bodies dropping everywhere. The level of violence per capita, I think, was a lot more severe here than it was in New York with the 5 families.
When you think about some of the crews, like especially the Youngstown crew, when they had that war with Cleveland over the Youngstown, Ohio rackets, 9 or 10 people were killed there, including a civilian who was mistaken for a mobster, and you look at that and you're like, man, that body count is like very close to what in the Colombo War, and it was this basically over this pretty small town, compared to the bigger cities in the U.S.
Yeah, but Ohio had a major family there. They're still there. They had a lot of control, making a lot of money too.
Yeah, Cleveland was a powerhouse for sure, and and there's a movie out there about the Cleveland family that and their war with Danny Green, an Irish mobster.
That Danny Green was the guy they allegedly couldn't kill. They eventually
this guy had more.
cars were blowing up on this guy left and right. He never died. I mean, he was
yeah. Until they finally got him
Yeah.
in the late 70s. It's after a dentist appointment they finally got
I
him.
talk to Joe Sadar once a month, just so you know he's alive and well.
Ah,
You know, they also had scams that were rather innovative. I was reading in your book, there was a baby selling scam, which I thought was pretty innovative. And for the mob to get involved in something like that was something new. I mean, this never happened in New York. They weren't actually selling babies; they were selling the idea of buying babies, but they never came through. If you could explain how that worked.
yeah, so it was a scam with one of the members who also eventually became pretty high up in the 1980s, and him and a few accomplices were basically defrauding people who were desperate to adopt babies and telling them they could get some for them. Luckily, and I'm glad they weren't actually doing it. They didn't actually have the babies. They were defrauding these desperate people.
They were just scam. That's all it was.
Yeah, it was a scam.
I thought it was pretty innovative, and this went on for a while. This wasn't just a couple of kids. I mean,
that's still going on. People doing that, scamming people for desperate
babies.
people for babies. Yeah,
but it seems out of character for the mafia to get involved.
Oh, right.
Well, it wasn't the mafia. You're talking about the whole organization condoned it. It was a group of guys and created a scam.
Yeah, but they were given life by the Genovese family in New York. They basically controlled them to a certain extent.
I'm sure they didn't know that was happening. That's all.
I know. Yeah, so they didn't have much control. I mean, they got very powerful. And this is what surprised me, that the amount of power they had. They started to expand outside of Pittsburgh. Could you tell us a little bit about that, Paul?
Yeah, so in the earlier years, they were definitely confined to the Pittsburgh geographic area, and then I'd say possibly as early as the 40s, but you really have a lot of good evidence for the 1950s and into the 60s. As I said, they start moving to Youngstown. Youngstown is kind of an open city, and there's a lot of different families that play in there. You have some Detroit people, Buffalo people, of course, Cleveland people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of a bombing war there. Not a lot of people die. There are some pretty terrible incidents, but there's a lot of what I would call message bombings. They blow up a guy's car when he's not in it, that kind of thing.
If they favored car bombs, if I have this right, Joey Naples, I believe it was, invented the remote control for a car.
Yeah, one of his associates, basically a guy with some tech savvy, I guess, back in the 60s. And this was in an FBI report. He was actually bragging about it to an FBI agent who was talking to him. Just like an on-the-street interview. He wasn't an informant. He was just talking to him. And he was like, yeah, I got to be careful. One of my guys built me this thing, and I can stand a block away and start my car up. And then if it blows up, I know that somebody's trying to get me.
Gee, too bad he didn't patent it.
I know.
I mean, it's who would think that a remote car starter was invented by organized crime? But that was
as a life-saving device.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll have to tell my cute mom that when she goes to open her car, I'll say,
there you go.
Yeah.
Why, your mother's got problems?
No, but I'm gonna scare her. No, my mother is the most straight arrow you've ever met. She's wonderful. So I've got a question, Paul. What got you started and interested in this?
So I'm from that area originally. I haven't lived there for a long time, but I grew up in I was born in a city called Johnstown, and that's where most of my family still lives, most of my older relatives. And that was the place where one of the mob's crews was, a very quiet crew led by Joe Regino, who was friends with the Don that I was talking about earlier, John LaRocca. Him and John LaRocca used to go down and vacation with their wives down in Florida together. And so it was a quiet place for the mob. There's only one murder that I found in that city itself. But I heard a few stories from my grandfather, who he wasn't Italian, but he worked at the steel mills and all that. So he knew some of those stories that went around. And like the one man who was killed was tangentially related to him. He was married to one of his cousins. So like the one hit that actually happened in Johnstown was something that he knew a little bit about. And there's another book that it's called Small Time that this New York Times bestselling author Russ Shorto wrote that's about Johnstown and the crew back in the 1960s. My book's focused more on the modern mafia, but I do get into that history too. But yeah, so it was that, and just reading about the Porter trial, when I was basically a kid, and that was a big organized crime trial in Western PA, and just seeing some of those machines in different bars and pizza places that we would go to, and wondering where did that stuff come from, the Joker poker and all that. And then later on, I found out where it came from.
Funny you should bring that up. You and I had a talk this afternoon before the show. You mentioned a name in the book, John Duffy Connolly, involved with the Pittsburgh OC family. He was a friend of mine. When I moved here, I didn't know anybody. I wasn't trying to meet anybody either. I came here to write, and somehow I gravitate to these people, or they gravitate to me. This was a guy we just started talking in a bar one night, it was in a restaurant. I was at a table. He was at another table, and he turned around to me and says, "You have an accent." And I said, "I don't have an accent. You people have accents." And he got a laugh out of that. We started talking, and he couldn't have been more than, he was in his 30s, I would think.
Wow.
We became friends, and he said, naturally, the first question out of anybody's mouth or soon is, "What do you do?" So, and this is a couple of meetings after we went out to dinner, and he introduced me to a couple of people, and he said, I'm into gambling machines, Joker poker, like that. And I figured, well, this is harmless. I'm thinking about where I come from. If you wanted to do anything like that, you had to get permission. There had to be rules. People got cuts. Here, it didn't seem to be much of that. It depends. You had to have some friends, but it was kind of loose.
How many years ago are you talking?
30. No, 25.
Oh, so I mean, when you said he was only 30, so that was 25 years ago. Okay.
Well, that was back then. This is what I'm talking. And I figured, well, this kid has maybe a half a dozen machines somewhere, because a lot of people have Joker poker machines in their bars, and they're either privately owned or somebody sells them one. But this guy turns out had a fairly big operation, so he's approached by the FBI, and he said, "Listen, get all your machines out of all the bars you have," because he was telling me this, and he said there won't be any prosecution. There must have been some kind of political stuff involved. They wanted the Joker poker machines out of all the bars in Pittsburgh, and he had the majority of them. He was pretty big, so he basically told them to go screw themselves. And he's telling me this story, and he's laughing. He said, "What are they? It's gambling machines. What can they do to me?" Well, you know what they did to him? Got 13 years in the federal penitentiary for Joker poker machines.
Holy cow.
13 years.
Hope he made a lot of money.
He was making scads of money, but I didn't get to spend it. I mean, once he went in,
he had it in the can to come out when he got, so he had a nice thing to come
out. Well, I asked Paul about that. Has the guy surfaced anywhere? Paul, you heard that he passed away?
It's a possibility. Unfortunately, I didn't get to look it up before I got to the show. He's definitely a more minor player in my book. I didn't dig into him a lot, but he definitely was affiliated with some of the guys based on some of the documents I've seen, and some of the reporting in the newspapers. He was probably making millions off that business you were talking about.
And it sort of surprised me. And I said, if this is what Southwestern Pennsylvania organized crime is like, this has to be very low key. And actually, your book wasn't around, and I wasn't really interested in researching. He seemed like an overgrown college jock to me. That was my attitude. And the guy winds up with 13 years. I couldn't believe it.
How old would he be now if he is alive?
Yeah, I'm going to check it out. I mean, I like the guy. He was a nice
guy.
What
would you think? I'm saying.
What do I think?
How old would he be?
He would be probably
60s, what I'm assuming.
65.
Yeah.
60, not an old man. I have to check it. I have friends who were more friendly with him than I was. From this relationship, I also got invited to a house by a guy by the name of Repepi. Can you tell us about him, Paul?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So Antonio Repepi was really one of the oldest members of the family. And, once again, according to FBI docs and newspaper articles and a few interviews I've done. And he was around for a very long time. I mean, like from the Black Hand days up until, and I'm not staring at my book right now, but he died in like the late 80s, early 90s. So he was like in his late 80s, in his 90s when he. Well, and he seemed to be still active up until.
Yeah, he was active. They also owned a very big winery in this area, but this I think this will complicate here. The first book I wrote, I self-published, as some of us do when we're breaking into the business. And the woman who signed my book cover, who I didn't know, I happened to meet her in a supermarket. She says she's an artist. Things lead to things. She designs the cover of my book. And then I didn't see her anymore until she calls me one day and she says, Mr. Repepi wants to meet you. And I don't know who Mr. Repepi was. So I well, why should I do this? She says, well, he's very influential in the area, and John Connolly thinks highly of you, and he just wants to meet you. And I'm probably thinking this was the elder Repepi, because this was an old man, and this was probably 92. So I go to his house. It's a palatial mansion. The place was beautiful, and he's got a wing of the house. He was a big game hunter. Very active big game hunter. He had walls festooned with every animal you can think of, and some you couldn't even think of. I mean, there had to be 50 heads, rhinoceros, lions, elephants. I mean, you name it. I spent the whole afternoon with this guy and this woman and I think his son, who they never brought up anything about anything. They just were talking about anything, and they're very, very low key, polite. Yes, you can tell when somebody knows how to charm somebody. They ask you more questions about you than and everybody likes to talk about themselves. But I recognize it right away. I mean, they're just trying to be friendly. But
probably took you on the job down there undercover.
Believe me, they knew who I was before I even.
I'm saying that, but they probably thought maybe he was doing a special.
They knew I was retired. But he liked to read.
What did he want?
I forgot.
Want? Just to be a friend? What did he end up wanting? Was he just want to be your friend?
Just wanted to socialize. Last time I ever saw the guy, and as Paul is saying, this was in the early 90s. I probably left and he died the next week. I mean, he was an old guy.
Yeah, it's probably close to it.
No, I'm saying, so you only met him once.
Met him once. That's it. Yeah, that was, and I didn't know, I didn't know who the hell he was. Afterwards, I asked around. I said, "Oh yeah, he's an old gangster." And I'm looking around and figured, well, I still didn't grasp the size of and the involvement of organized crime in this area. You couldn't go any place to do anything. Southwestern PA in the small towns are big gambling towns. I mean, high stakes poker games, big money bet. In the movie The Hustler, when the movie starts, Paul Newman and his handler are on their way to New York to play Minnesota Fats. And the opening scene is they're going to stop somewhere to get something to eat, get a couple of drinks, and they walk into a bar, and there's a pool table. There's pool tables in every bar around here. And of course, it's Paul Newman. He's a hustler, and he winds up beating whoever he's playing out of all kinds of money. The scene only lasts for maybe 7 minutes. That scene was shot in this town. And this was a big pool hustling area for many, many years. The best players in the world would come to Monessen, Pennsylvania to gamble. Something else I never knew.
And that's where you live, right?
That's where I live.
I remember putting out on a Christmas card or something.
There's more bookies now in this town. I think than there are cops. I mean, everybody's a bookie. I mean, it's kids in their 20s are taking book, old people. I bought my house from a bookie.
Is that currently?
Yeah. Yeah. And she it was a female bookie, and it had a big operation. Was married to a police lieutenant, and I bought the house from the both of them. But believe me, it was her money. Cops around here don't make any money, and big corruption problems. And that's why I found your book so fascinating, Paul, because you got into the dirt. You mentioned something. I'm trying to find it in my notes. Cops. The organized crime was running bingo games, but they always did. But they were in partnership with cops.
Yeah, so at times there were partners, and then if you go back to their really early history that we were mentioning before too, they were also competitors. I think that's one of the reasons why the family back in the earlier days wasn't as powerful as other mafia families were at that same time period, is because politicians and the cops in Pittsburgh were running their own operations back then, for booze and gambling. So there was competition early on, and then later on, they became partners. And especially the best evidence is in Youngstown, because that crew got completely taken down in the 90s. And a lot of people flipped, and a lot of good information came out. But they owned Youngstown, and the maid guy who was there, his name was Lenny Strollo, was appointing, police officers basically.
Wait, can we take a break here? Because we're a little bit overdue on going to a word from our sponsor. John, you want to take us there, please?
I'll be right back. Now, don't go anywhere. We know where you live. Yeah, and we do. We'll be right back.
This is Patrick Piccarelli, co-host of the Hollywood Godfather podcast. I'm also the president of Condo Security and Investigations, a full-time investigative and security firm established in 1988. We are located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, with worldwide affiliates. Our business paradigm is simple: to provide the most professional services possible while maintaining an ethical standard and client satisfaction. Our areas of expertise include criminal and civil investigations, asset searches, surveillance, executive protection, question documents, background investigations, computer forensics, polygraph, and many other services. Our staff consists of former law enforcement professionals with hundreds of years of combined experience. Your initial consultation is free. Visit our website, www.condorprivateeye.com, or call 724-396-2808. Thank you.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, Paul, on that line, you're talking about cops. One small town police department. I live in an area where there's 5 towns, and you can walk to any one of them. They're really small, and they're really cramped together. One police department was a burglary ring when I lived here, when I first moved here. And the cops, I don't know if it was the entire department, but the entire department was maybe 15 or 20 cops anyway. So it was a vast majority of the department. The guy that was running it was a police sergeant who was murdered in his bed while I was shot in the head about 2 years after I moved here. So there was a lot of stuff going on with the cops and organized crime figures. So Henry Zatola, share with us who he was.
So he was someone who came to the attention of the family like the 60s, 70s. He started appearing in sort of like documents and newspaper articles in the 70s. But he was a longtime associate of the family. Like everybody else, he was involved in gambling enterprises. I haven't seen so much on the drug side for him. And I believe, given the document interviews I've done, that he was probably the last made guy in Pittsburgh, the one who was made last, I should say. Not the last made guy to die in Pittsburgh, but the the last one who was made, probably around 1989 or so. It's a little sketchy on that. And the FBI guys from that time, they fully admit that he was a part of the family, but they didn't really know about any ceremony that he was a part of. So they officially still consider him an associate. The ones that I talked to, like I said, I believe he was actually made because he was over the gentleman that I talked about in Youngstown, Lenny Strollo. He was the person who collected the money from the made guys and associates in Youngstown and allegedly brought it over to the boss, Mike Genovese, giving him his cut every few weeks. And he took a management role in Youngstown for sure.
What was the Rincon Tribal Council?
So the Rincon tribe is an Indian tribe that's out in the San Diego area. If you've ever been to San Diego, there's a lot of desert around there.
So how did organized crime from Pittsburgh area wind up with Rincon?
Sure. So in the 90s, they were looking for a good outlet to launder their millions of dollars in gambling profits. And there was this Rincon casino out near San Diego was desperate for basically a management company so they could open their casino back up. Their casino had been shut down in the late 80s, early 90s because the Chicago family was involved in it and an investor basically, and a lot of people got arrested. And the casino was shut down, and then they went looking for new takers. And the Pittsburgh group came knocking. So they have bad luck with investors. And
do you know when that happened?
What's that?
Do you know when that happened?
Yeah, so this whole scheme happened in the mid 90s. So just a few years after the Chicago family got kicked out.
Well, you know who that was, right? It was Tony Accardo, just so you know.
Oh, for the leadership of the Chicago. Yeah.
They had cheat on him. He couldn't go out of his house.
There was a woman involved in this, Ruth Kalek.
Yeah, Ruth Kalek was the tribal representative, and the Pittsburgh family tried to hide behind this group called the Columbia Group that was supposedly a group of legit investors from the Pittsburgh area. And your old friend Conley was actually mentioned in this case as one of those possible investors. And basically, this Henry Zatola went out. He was kind of the lead on this, and him and another made guy from Ohio named Pasquale Ferruccio, who was also in the Pittsburgh family. He was the Ohio faction. And they went out there and they paid off Ruth Kalek. And so she looked the other way, accepted their investment. They were able to open up a casino, but it only operated for one full day with the Joker poker machines because
One day?
Yeah. One day in 1996.
One day in a row?
What kind of investment was that? Even Bugsy Siegel had a better run than that.
Basically, the government was onto them while the scheme was going on, and the Joker poker machines were illegally obtained, and they took them out of the casino. So the casino actually stayed open for a few months, but without Joker poker, it wasn't making any money. So that one day they were at full capacity. The other days they just had card games basically and bingo. So it didn't last long.
They had a woman spy in the FBI also.
They did.
Which is gold. Her name was Jacqueline Weinard.
Weimar. And yeah, so she it's kind of an accident the way it happened. She was dating a guy named John Caraba, who she had met at a bar. And he was an associate of the family. And once he found out what she did, he started to pump her for information. And they went out for a few years. And then it was from, I think, 1982 to 1985.
Not to use the pun, but that's a lot of pumping.
Yeah. So for like 3 years, she was given information, like handing over documents and telling them things. She was the secretary for the organized crime squad. And then they eventually figured out there was a leak because people were lambing it before they were arresting them and things like that. And one of the more infamous guys, the guy named Nick Blake, got tipped off through that Weimar pipeline and ran off to Jamaica before he was picked up. They eventually picked him up later, but stuff like that put him on to the fact that somebody was given information, and they figured out it was her, and she got arrested in 1985, as did her boyfriend. What's that?
She did jail time?
No, she got probation, from what I understand. Her boyfriend did go to prison for a few years, but she was fired and just got probation, so she got off kind of easy.
I'll say that
no happen. Pension though. That's a big thing.
Yeah, no pension.
Yeah.
In the movie Goodfellas, at the end, when the Henry Hill character starts to get jammed up, he's using a lot of coke. He's selling coke behind his boss's back. He keeps referring to his Pittsburgh connection. I just thought that was something that they stuck in the movie because it sounded good, but this was real. He was dealing with a guy named Nick the Blade.
Yeah, the guy that I just mentioned, his name is Nick the Blade Jeswale. His real name was Eugene. He got the moniker the Blade because he liked to use a knife during fights with people. And he was, especially to the agent that I was talking to, basically the guy that they love to hate. He was, kind of an enforcer type, definitely a drug dealer, and somebody who was famous within the family. Everybody knew who he was because of how violent he was and because of how flashy he was. He had a Jaguar that he drove around. He was very much someone who wasn't sort of the archetypal Pittsburgh mobster. He was super flashy and in your face all the time. And it was only a matter of time before he got arrested, but he managed to keep out of jail for quite a while, for like 10, 15 years, really, by intimidating witnesses. And, there's one story I have in the book where a guy lodged an assault charge against him. And there's a story that Nick the Blade tried to basically hit him with his car, and then he jumped out, fired a few shots at him, and then, told him like, hey, you better drop that charge or I'm going to kill you, basically. And he did. And he was the
Groucho handbook and the John Gotti handbook about witnesses.
Yeah, exactly. And he was the Pittsburgh connection. I'm not sure that he directly met with Henry Hill, but one of Nick the Blade's associates who was in his drug enterprise was a guy named Paul Mazie, and he was the one who was kind of the connection with Henry Hill directly.
I knew Henry, basically brought up in the same Queens neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm wondering how he got that Pittsburgh connection. I mean, there could be all kinds of reasons how he managed to meet him. But to go all the way to Pittsburgh for coke, that's a hell of a trip.
Yeah. If I'm remembering correctly, he knew Paul Mazie from somewhere. I'm forgetting the exact story, but Paul Mazie had connections on the East Coast itself. And they maybe they met in prison or something like that. I'm sorry, I can't remember that specific detail, but it was through Mazie that he was able to get Jeswale's drugs.
Okay, we have gone through the inception of the mob, the rise of the mob, and the expansion of the mob from the Pittsburgh area, south and west into Youngstown, Cleveland. We'd like to have you back next week, if that's okay with you, to talk about all these mob organizations eventually, or some of them do anyway, wind up reaching a pinnacle. It's like in New York was probably the 80s. Then everything started to go downhill. They're still around, of course. But next week, I think our listeners would like to hear how they started to degenerate and how it actually came to an end as far as organized crime as we know it. Or like I'd like to call it around here now, is disorganized crime. The last made guy, there was actually a last made guy in this area. So we'd be very interested in having you back next week. And thank you for being on the show tonight. And we're looking forward to part 2.
Definitely. Thank you.
Hey, tell us the name of your book one more time before we sign off.
It's Steel City Mafia, Blood, Betrayal, and Pittsburgh's Last Dawn.
And where could we get those books or our audience?
So anywhere you can buy books online, especially Amazon, and my publisher's website, it's the History Press. And then you can also find them in stores in Western Pennsylvania if you live there, and Eastern Ohio. So,
all right. Well,
Barnes and Noble.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, and we'll be seeing you next week.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
All right.
And that was that. But I'll be back.
Thank you for tuning in to the Hollywood Godfather podcast. Do you have a question for the mailbag? We love hearing from our fans and answering questions about past or future episodes, your favorite celebrities, or anything you'd like to know. Submit your questions online at HollywoodGodfatherPodcast.com, or you can call us at 646-776-3038 and leave us a message. Who knows, your question may even make it on the air. Remember to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Hollywood Godfather and at Real Gianni Russo. If you like our show and you like what we're doing, please leave us a review on your podcast or video streaming service. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Now we'll be back next week with a new exciting show, and who knows who may be joining us. Until next time.
Never get too old to have a little fun. Come on, I'm Gianni Russo, a genuine one of a kind. What a ride it's been, this life of mine. And I ain't done yet. I'll be back. Until next time.
And that was that.
When I was 17, it was a very good year. It was a very good year for small town girls and soft summer nights. We'd hide from the lights on the village green when I was 17.